The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the sort of day that had no business changing anyone's life. Marian Ashby read it twice at the kitchen table, the paper held close to the window where the morning light was strongest, because she had learned long ago to use every advantage the light afforded. The handwriting was her cousin's, slanting and impatient. The letters crowded together as though the writer resented the time writing cost, and the news it contained was this: that Hartwell Manor required a new housekeeper, that the position paid 3 times what Marian earned at present, and that the Duke of Ashmore had specified, through his estate solicitor, a woman of mature years and proven discretion, someone who would not be dazzled by the appointment. Her cousin had written the last line with what Marian recognized as gentle pity. "I thought of you at once, of course. You have never been dazzled by anything in your life." She did not know then that the letter would cost her everything she had built out of invisibility and replace it with something she had long since stopped believing she was owed. Had she known, she would have folded the paper just as carefully, tucked it just as precisely into her apron pocket, and gone to speak to Mrs. Fitch about releasing her from her post. She was that kind of woman, the kind who opens the door even after she has read the weather. Marian was 40 years old. She had been plain at 20 and had grown into her plainness by 30 in the way that some women grow into their height, without apology, with a certain useful authority. She was neither tall nor short, neither fashionably pale nor ruddily robust. She had dark eyes that her mother had called watchful, and her employers had called reliable, and which she herself considered simply efficient, since she had learned that most human business was conducted in the face and the hands, and that a person who paid attention to those 2 things rarely needed to ask questions. She kept her brown hair wound close at the nape of her neck. She wore gray. She had been hired, fired, grieved, cheated, and overlooked in roughly that order over the past 20 years, and she had arrived at 40 with no husband, no children, no inheritance, and an expertise in household management so thorough that she could recite the linen inventory of any house she had served in, year by year, from memory. She had, in short, been rendered invisible by circumstances, and had then made a tool of that invisibility. The manor houses of England did not see women like Marian Ashby. They saw housekeepers, which was a different thing, a useful and interchangeable thing, and Marian had found that being a useful and interchangeable thing offered a remarkable view. The deadline imposed itself clearly in the solicitor's letter attached to her cousins. She was to present herself at Hartwell Manor no later than the 1st of October, which was 3 weeks hence, or the position would be offered to the next candidate. The solicitor's handwriting was different from her cousin's, upright, evenly spaced, the hand of a man who weighed each letter, and there was a line at the bottom that she read 3 times without being certain she understood it correctly. "His Grace is aware that the position requires discretion of a particular kind. Candidates are advised that the household contains matters not for common discussion. Commitment to this condition is a prerequisite of employment." She folded that letter more carefully than the first. She had, over 20 years, learned that the houses which advertised their need for discretion were either concealing grief or concealing guilt, and that the difference between the 2 was everything. She was at Hartwell Manor on the 28th of September, 3 days early, because she had also learned that punctuality was a form of honesty. The manor sat at the end of a long drive lined with chestnuts gone early to gold, and the light through them on that bright morning was the color of old coins. It was a substantial house, 3 stories of gray stone, east and west wings, gardens that had been magnificent and were now merely extensive. But what Marian noticed first, before the architecture, or the gardens, or the liveried groom who met her carriage, was the silence. Not the silence of emptiness. the silence of a house holding its breath. She had catalogued 3 maids, 2 footmen, a butler of rigid posture and assessing eyes named Colm, and the state of the linen press on the 2nd floor, excellent, which argued for a conscientious previous housekeeper before she heard him. She did not see him first. She heard his voice in the corridor outside the study where Colm had deposited her to wait, and the voice was low and unhurried, speaking to someone she could not identify, and what it said was this: "Tell Mr. Graves I will not receive any more of his assurances. I will receive the accounts." A door opened. The Duke of Ashmore came into the study and stopped when he saw her, because she was 3 days early and he had not expected her, and the expression on his face in that unguarded moment was not displeasure. It was something she catalogued and filed away, as a man reaching for a mask he had set down for a moment and finding someone watching. He was, she thought, somewhere in his middle 40s, taller than she had expected, heavier in the shoulder, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had since been worked on by weather and something else she could not name yet. His hands, she noted, were calloused at the palm for a man of his rank, which was the first interesting thing. He wore no rings. His coat was good but not recent. "You are early," he said. "I am, Your Grace. I wish to be certain of the road." A pause. He assessed her the way she had just assessed him, which she found she did not resent. "Colm will show you the household." "He has begun to," Marian said. "I have seen the linen press on the 2nd floor. The inventory is thorough. I should like to see the accounts next, when it is convenient." Something moved in his expression. Not warmth, closer to attention, the way a man looks up from his work when a sound interrupts it that turns out to be worth interrupting for. "The accounts," he repeated. "I find they tell the truth of a house more clearly than anything else." He looked at her for a moment longer than politeness required. "My solicitor tells me you have managed 4 houses of this size." 5. "Your Grace, Mr. Pemberton's house in Derbyshire is generally omitted from the count, because my tenure there was 6 weeks. I left because the cook was being shorted in the marketing accounts. Mr. Pemberton did not wish to pursue the matter. And you wished to pursue it. I wished not to be a party to it." It was not quite the first time she saw something in his face that was not the mask. But it was the first time she could name it. It was recognition. The involuntary kind. The kind that costs something. He did not acknowledge it. "You may have the accounts this afternoon." He left. She stood in the study a moment longer, looking at the door he had closed behind him, and thought, grief, then not guilt. At least in part. At least from him, she was not certain, 3 days in, that he was the only one who needed investigating. His name was Edmund Ashmore, and he had been the 5th Duke of Ashmore for 11 years, inheriting the title and the debt and the rumor simultaneously at the age of 34 when his father died. The rumor, as Marian assembled it from the stratified testimony of the housemaids, the cook, the stable hands, and old Colm himself, who did not gossip so much as issue statements of historical record in a tone that did not invite questions, was this, that the Duke had been married, once, to a woman named Catherine, and that she had died 4 years into the marriage, and that her death was spoken of in the county in a lowered voice that meant something. Though what it meant depended entirely on who was lowering their voice. She was ill, Colm told Marian on her 3rd evening, when she asked him directly over the household ledger. He said it in the flat way of a man who has said it many times and found it insufficient. What kind of ill? The kind that comes on slow. Marian set down her pen. She had a habit, when she wanted an honest answer from someone who had decided to be careful, of going very still, not leaning in, not pressing, simply becoming the sort of quiet that the other person feels they need to fill. It had worked on cooks and stewards and solicitors' clerks for 20 years, and it worked now on Colm, who added, after a moment, "There are those in the county who say it was more than illness, and are those people in a position to know? They are in a position to have been told by a man who had reason to tell them." "What man?" "Mr. Graves," he said, "is the Duke's cousin. He has managed the investments of the estate since before the Duke's father died. He visits quarterly. When does he visit next?" "Tomorrow," Colm said, and went to bed. Marian sat with the ledger a moment longer. Then she opened it again, went back 4 years, and began to read. The accounts were interesting. Not obviously wrong. The figures were tidy, the columns balanced, the categories correct. But Marian had been reading household accounts since she was 19 years old, and she knew the difference between tidiness and accuracy. Accurate accounts had a kind of irregular life to them. The numbers were not too round, the patterns were not too clean, the small items varied in ways that reflected the actual unpredictable cost of running a house. These accounts were too smooth, the kind of smoothness that is the result of a very good mathematical mind applying itself after the fact, when no individual line was obviously wrong, but the aggregate had the faint unreality of a stage set, everything present, nothing lived in. She closed the ledger, pressed the heel of her hand to her sternum where something cold had settled, and permitted herself exactly 3 minutes of that cold before she put it away and went upstairs to bed. She did not tell him. Not yet. She had no proof, only pattern, and she had learned long ago that pattern without proof was conjecture, and conjecture offered to the wrong person at the wrong moment was simply a weapon handed to one's enemies. The thing she could not yet lay before him was the simple question of why. Why someone had been adjusting the accounts at Hartwell, and for how long, and toward what end. The what had a shape. The why was still shadow. She could not move on shadow. She had, she told herself, until October was out, which was roughly 5 weeks. The solicitor's letter had been a contract for a month's trial. She could not prove in 5 weeks what she could not yet name. She would try anyway. Mr. Graves arrived at 11 the next morning, and she heard him before she saw him, which was by now a pattern she noted. He was speaking to one of the footmen in the entrance hall, and his voice was the warmest voice she had encountered in the house, smooth and pleasant, unhurried, the kind of voice that took the difficulty out of being in a room. She came down the main stair with the list of kitchen requisitions she was bringing to the Duke, and Graves turned when he heard her step, and smiled. And the smile arrived at exactly the right speed. "You must be the new housekeeper," he said. "My cousin speaks well of you already. He has been very kind," Marian said, which was not precisely true. Edmund Ashmore had been exacting, occasional, and frequently in the estate office with the door closed, but he had twice said something at dinner. She dined apart, of course, with Colm and the upper servants, but the walls of Hartwell carried sound with a particular fidelity that had made her understand he was paying closer attention than he showed. Graves was a lean, immaculate man, a handful of years younger than the Duke, with reddish gold hair worn back from a face that was arranged in permanent pleasantness the way some houses were arranged for viewing. He dressed well. His hands were smooth. He smiled at her again, a fraction too warmly, the way a man smiles at a woman he has already decided is no threat. "You must find Hartwell very quiet," he said. "I find it very orderly," she said, and carried the requisitions list to the estate office. The Duke was there. He was at his desk with what she recognized as the investment portfolio, a leather-bound set of figures she had not yet had access to, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man whose concentration has been interrupted and who is deciding how to feel about it. "The kitchen order, Your Grace." She set the paper on the corner of his desk. She did not look at the portfolio. She was aware, in a way she had trained herself to be aware of these things without demonstrating it, of every number visible on the open page. "Your cousin has arrived," she said. "I know." She turned to go. Then he said, behind her, "Mrs. Ashby." She stopped. "How long?" he said, slowly, as though he had decided to ask a question he had been deliberating. "Does it generally take you to determine the true condition of a household?" She turned back. He was looking at her steadily. "Not the mask. Not quite. That depends," she said, "on how much has been concealed, and how carefully." A pause that had weight in it. "And if a great deal has been concealed very carefully?" "Then it takes," she said, "precisely as long as it takes to find the one thing the concealment forgot to account for." He said nothing. She said nothing. The clock on the mantel ran on unconcerned. Then she said, quietly, because she had decided in the 4 seconds of that silence that the promissory note needed to be placed, "There is something I need to show you. I am not yet in a position to do so. I would ask you not to conclude any business with Mr. Graves until I am." She watched his face. This was her gift. She could read the precise taxonomy of a man choosing what to show and what to withhold in a given second, and what she read in Edmund Ashmore's face was not suspicion of her, not dismissal, not the polite stonewalling she had expected. It was recognition again, the sharp, involuntary kind, and underneath it something older and more painful, the expression of a man who has been waiting for someone to say exactly those words for a very long time and had stopped expecting they would ever be said. "Very well," he said. She left. In the corridor, she allowed herself 4 seconds of something she would not call relief because it was too fragile, and then she went to have a look at what the kitchen garden was doing in this October weather, because she thought better when her hands were occupied, and she had a great deal to think about. October pressed on with the characteristic efficiency of a month that knows it is running out. Marian worked. She cataloged, cross-referenced, repaired, and managed the household with the precision she had been perfecting for 20 years, and she did all of it with the secondary attention she had trained in herself, the part that was always listening, watching, cataloging not linen, but people. Not inventory, but behavior. She watched Graves at dinner on the evenings he stayed, noting the way he watched Edmund when Edmund was not looking, not warmly, not enviously exactly, but with the focused attention of a man running calculations. She watched the way Colm watched Graves, neutral on the surface, and underneath neutral, braced. She watched Edmund, watched neither of them. His attention turned always inward, or toward the window, or toward the accounts she now understood he was beginning to suspect, but could not prove without the key she had not yet handed him. On the 4th day after Graves arrived, she found it. It was in the still room. She had been going through the household remedies, a routine task, the inventory of tinctures and tisanes that any well-run house kept current, and she found, tucked behind the labeled bottles on the lowest shelf, a small brown bottle without a label, 3/4 full of a pale liquid. She did not smell it. She wrapped it in her handkerchief, put it in her pocket, and carried it downstairs with the equanimity of a woman who has found something terrible and cannot afford to look as though she has. She knew what it was. She had managed 11 years ago a house in which a similar bottle had appeared under similar circumstances, and she had at that time been too young and too new and too uncertain of her own reading to act on what she suspected until it was late. She was not too young now. She locked it in her room. She went to supper. She watched Graves describe, across the table, a capital investment opportunity in the Lancashire wool trade that he wished to bring before the Duke the following morning, and she watched Edmund's face do the thing it did when he was listening to something that required more patience than interest. And she thought, tomorrow morning then, she told him that evening. She knocked at the estate office door at 9 o'clock, when the household had settled, and when he said come in, she went in, closed the door behind her, and sat down without being invited, because this was not, she had decided, a conversation to have while standing. He looked at her. She put the wrapped bottle on his desk. "I found this in the still room," she said, "on the lowest shelf, behind the labeled stock. There is no label." A pause. "I have seen a bottle like it before." She watched him look at it. She watched the color of his face not change and the muscles of his jaw do something careful. "Where a house I served in Warwickshire, 11 years ago. The mistress of that house was ill for 14 months. She paused. "The kind of ill that comes on slow. You are saying..." "I am saying that I would like to have the contents of this bottle tested by a pharmacist before I say anything definitive. I am saying that the household accounts for the past 3 years have a character I have not seen outside of deliberate alteration. I am saying that the investment portfolio you showed me for 4 seconds on Tuesday," a slight movement in his expression at the confirmation that she had seen it, "has a particular irregularity in the column for quarterly transfers that I would like to examine more closely." She stopped. "I am not saying I am certain. I am saying I am certain enough that you should not sign anything Mr. Graves brings you tomorrow morning, and I am asking you to trust me for 3 more days." Edmund Ashmore looked at her for a long time. The fire ran behind him. Outside, the October wind moved in the chestnuts, and she could hear it through the old stone walls. "How did you know," he said finally, "to look?" "I looked because it is my job to look. I found it because no one thought a housekeeper would." Something in his face then that was not recognition this time, and was not the mask. She filed it carefully, turned it over once, and set it aside. This was not the moment. 3 days, he said. 3 days. He picked up the bottle and held it in his working hands, turning it in the light, and she thought, watching him, that she had been wrong earlier about the expression on his face. It was not simply recognition. It was the expression of a man who has been carrying a weight alone for a very long time and has just been offered, for the first time, another hand on the rope. She went to bed. She did not sleep for some time. The next morning, Edmund Ashmore told his cousin that the matter of the Lancashire investment required additional review and could not be concluded before the end of the month. Graves smiled. "Of course," he said. "I understand entirely. These decisions should not be rushed." Marian, passing the morning room with the household accounts she had no need to be carrying past the morning room, heard every word. She did not alter her pace. 3 days. She had 3 days, and the first had just begun. She went to the village. The pharmacist in the village of Hartwell Cross was a small, round man named Mr. Addison, with alert eyes behind thick spectacles, and he received the bottle with the professional neutrality of a man accustomed to being brought things people were afraid to name. He asked no questions. She asked him for his most thorough analysis. He told her to come back Thursday. Wednesday was the intimacy of shared trouble, which Marian had not expected and should have predicted, because trouble shared in the right company had a way of becoming something else entirely. Edmund found her in the estate office at 7 in the morning, going through the 3-year ledger, with the careful focus she brought to things that required her complete attention, and instead of leaving. He sat down across the desk from her and said, "Tell me what you see." She told him. She walked him through it line by line, the 2 clean columns, the quarterly transfers that were always a figure ending in 0. The household expenses that had been rounded in ways that normal household expenses were not rounded. The subtle pattern of cost inflation in categories that were difficult to verify: fuel, medication, specialist physicians. He listened. He did not interrupt. He sat with his calloused hands flat on the desk and his gray eyes moving across the columns she indicated, and she watched him assembling something in his expression that she recognized as not grief and not anger, but the particular cold clarity of a man who has suspected for a long time and has been waiting for someone to confirm the architecture of what he suspected. "He has been managing my father's investments since before my father died," Edmund said quietly. "He was with us every quarter for 11 years. "The alteration begins," Marian said, "about 8 months before your wife died." A silence. She watched him receive that. He said nothing for a moment, and she did not press, because she understood this was a place where a man needed to be given the time. "She was ill," he said at last. "The physicians could not agree on the cause. One of them," he stopped. "One of them suggested, near the end, that it had the character of something introduced rather than contracted. I had him dismissed. I did not believe it. I did not want to believe it, and then she died, and I had no proof, and accusing without proof meant," he stopped again. "It meant destroying yourself along with him," Marian said. "Yes, what does he inherit, if you were to die without an heir?" "The entailed portion of the estate. It is substantial." She nodded. She had already known this, or guessed it. The arithmetic of it had been in the account patterns like a signature. She wrote down one more figure in her notebook, closed it, and said, "Tomorrow." He looked at her. "You said 3 days. The pharmacist will have his analysis Thursday." She met his eyes directly, which she did not often do with employers, and which she noticed he did not look away from. "I said 3 days because I believed 3 days was what I needed." "I was correct." He almost smiled. It was so close to a smile that she catalogued it as a category distinct from his usual expression, something that had started to open and then thought better of it. "Are you always correct about what you need?" "Frequently," she said. "It is less comfortable than one would expect." He did look at her then, the whole of her face, and she sat still under it the way she had learned to be still under attention she did not seek, and there was a moment, a genuine moment, 8 seconds perhaps, in which neither of them pretended to be looking at ledgers. "The accounts," she said. "Yes," he said. "The accounts." They went back to work. The fire between them ran on without comment. Outside, the October morning came fully into the room, and the light moved across the columns of figures on the desk, and Marian Ashby thought, "There is something here I am not yet in a position to name, and this is also not the moment," and she turned the page. At dinner that evening, Graves told a story about a hunting party in Suffolk that had the footman smiling and the Duke attentive, and at the end of the story he said, "You have been very quiet, Edmund. Is the new housekeeper working you too hard?" He said it lightly, warmly, in the perfectly pleasant voice, and glanced at the door beyond which he believed Marian to be sitting with Colm and the upper servants. She was not. She was in the passage outside the dining room, replacing a candle sconce that had loosened from the wall, and she heard every word. She heard Edmund say, "Mrs. Ashby is exceptionally competent," and she heard the pause after it, And then, Graves say, with the gentlest possible emphasis, you must be careful, cousin. She is a woman who has come to you with excellent references that I have not yet had verified. She heard Edmund say, I should like to see them verified. I will have Whitmore look into it, Graves said. And she heard in his voice the faint new quality of a man who has noticed something and is beginning to recalculate. She pressed her back flat against the passage wall and breathed once, slowly. He had seen something. Not the bottle. She was certain of that. But she had shown herself, perhaps, to be more than the category he had filed her under. She was no longer invisible. That was the moment, she thought, when the clock truly began running. Thursday came. She went to the village alone, by the back road, in the gray early morning before the household was fully awake, and Mr. Addison, the pharmacist, handed her a folded note with the expression of a man confirming what he had suspected. She read it outside in the October wind, standing at the edge of his step. Compound of aconite derivative, he had written. Administered in repeated small doses over months, this would produce symptoms consistent with a wasting illness, fatigue, loss of appetite, progressive organ failure. Death would appear natural and would likely be attributed to illness by all but the most suspicious physician. She folded the note. She put it in her boot. She walked back to Hartwell Manor and went straight to the estate office and put the note on Edmund's desk. He read it. He read it a second time. He set it down. He put his hands flat on the desk. She watched him breathe. Catherine, he said. Yes, she waited. I am sorry. I am very sorry. He sat with it for a moment that she understood was his alone. She looked at the window. Outside, the last of the October leaves were releasing from the chestnuts, turning in the pale light on the way down. Then he said, What do we need? She had been ready for this. The bottle and Mr. Addison's analysis. The altered accounts, marked at every discrepancy, compared side by side with the original invoices that will still be in the estate archive. He will have missed some. He always does. A witness who can crack, she paused, and Graves himself, present, in a room with named people watching. Calm, he said. Yes, and I would suggest your solicitor, Miss Farnham, and possibly Sir William Hatch from the county bench, if you have the standing to ask him. A slight pause. I have the standing, he said dryly, and that was when she heard it, the first genuine dryness. The first flash of something that was almost wit. It was so brief and so unexpected that she felt it the way you feel the first warmth of a fire after a long, cold road, and she filed it carefully with everything else she was not yet in a position to examine. Tomorrow, then, she said. Tomorrow, he agreed. There was one more thing. She said it carefully. Your cousin's man, Whitmore, has been sent to verify my references. He looked at her. He will find them impeccable, she said. They are impeccable. But the inquiry tells us that Mr. Graves is now paying attention to me. He will try to move before we do if he suspects we are preparing. She met his eyes. Do not let him leave the house tonight. He nodded. She went to prepare. The invitation to dinner that Edmund extended to Graves that evening was warm and apparently social, and Marian watched it from the upper landing where she had no business being at 5:30, and where she was nonetheless, having developed a reliable personal policy about the usefulness of upper landings. She watched Graves receive the invitation, smile. Except she watched the small flicker of recalculation in his pleasant face as he wondered what it meant. She watched his hand, his smooth, careful hand, go to the pocket of his coat and rest there for a fraction of a second. A letter. He had a letter in his pocket. She made a note of it. At dinner she was not present. because housekeepers did not dine with the family, and she had no intention of alerting Graves further, but Colm was present in his capacity as the Duke's senior domestic witness, and afterward he came to find her in the still room, ironic location, she thought, not for the first time, and told her what Graves had said at the end of the meal. He said he would need to return to London by morning, Colm reported. Urgent business. Marian was already standing. What did His Grace say? Colm looked at her with the expression she had come to read as his version of dry amusement. He said the roads were not safe at night, and that he insisted his cousin stay the night as his guest. She exhaled. Good, His Grace also said, Colm added, and I report this without editorializing, that the housekeeper had recommended a small supper of cold meats and preserved plums, and that he had arranged for Mr. Graves's preferences to be accommodated accordingly. She blinked. He did not. He did. Colm folded his hands behind his back. He is occasionally capable of humor, Mrs. Ashby. It is not generally encouraged. She did something then that she had not done in the hearing of any employer in 20 years, which was laugh, an actual laugh, brief and unguarded, gone almost before she knew it had come. Colm observed this with perfect stillness and the faintest possible elevation of one eyebrow, and she recovered herself, and they went to lay the plans for the morning. She did not sleep. She sat at her table with the marked ledger, the pharmacist's note, and the original invoices she had spent Thursday afternoon pulling from the archive, 7 of them, in 7 categories, each with a corresponding falsified entry in the household accounts. It was not difficult, once she had begun. The original invoices were in the archive boxes under the estate office, organized by year, in a hand she recognized as Graves's own, the upright, evenly spaced hand of a man who was methodical. He had been methodical enough to falsify. He had not been methodical enough to destroy the originals. She suspected he had kept them as his own insurance, the knowledge of what was in that archive, if he ever needed it. In that respect, and only that respect, she was grateful for him. At 2:30 in the morning, she found the final piece. It was in the 7th invoice box, fiscal year 4 years past, in a folder marked physician's expenses, and inside the folder, tucked behind the invoices for the legitimate physician visits, was a receipt from an apothecary in London, in a street she knew for certain was associated with no reputable practice, for a quantity of a compound she could not name from its listed ingredients, but could cross-reference against the notation in Mr. Addison's report. The receipt was in Graves's handwriting. It bore a false name, not his own, but the handwriting was unmistakable. She held it to the lamp and looked at it for a long time. Then she laid it alongside the pharmacist's note, the ledger, and the invoices, and squared all of it, corner to corner, into a tidy stack. She thought of Catherine Ashmore, whom she had never known. She thought of her with the careful honesty she tried to apply to things she could not undo. And then she thought of the morning and what needed to happen, and she went over the order of events 3 more times in her mind until she was certain she had them right. She was not saving anyone. Edmund Ashmore was not being rescued. He had been waiting for someone to hand him the key to the door he already knew was there. What she was doing was what she had always done, looking and telling the truth of what she saw, in the light, before witnesses who could confirm it. The way out was through the middle, in the light, with witnesses. She had believed this since she was 22 years old and had failed to act on it in a house in Warwickshire, and she had been paying the debt of that failure ever since, and this was not the morning she would fail again. Sir William Hatch arrived at 9 o'clock, which was earlier than Marian had expected, and which she took as a favorable omen, because Sir William was a man who, according to Colm's 3 sentences of characterization, did not get up before 10 unless the matter genuinely warranted it. Mr. Farnham the solicitor arrived at 9:30, having come overnight at Edmund's summons, still wearing his traveling coat. Colm positioned himself near the door of the library, where the gathering was to take place, with the contained readiness of a man who has been waiting a long time for a specific morning and intends to be present for every second of it. Graves came down to breakfast at 9:45 and found, instead of breakfast, the library full of people he had not anticipated. Marian watched him from the doorway. She saw the exact moment he understood. It was not panic. He was too careful for panic. But there was a split second, a single unguarded half-second, in which she read in his face the particular algebra of a man recalculating his options at speed and finding fewer than he had counted on. Then the pleasantness came back. It came back beautifully. He smiled and said, "Good morning. What a gathering. Am I being presented to the county? Sit down," Graves, Edmund said. He was standing at the head of the library table, and his voice was quiet. It was always quiet. He had never needed to raise it. He said, "There are things I must put before you, in company, before I know how to proceed." Graves sat. His hands lay in his lap, easy and still. He looked at Marian with an expression that was the softest she had ever seen. The absolute distillation of his pleasantness turned to its fullest power, and he said, "Your housekeeper seems to have been very busy." "She has," Edmund said. "As have you." The ledger went on the table. Marian put it there herself. She opened it to the first marked page and said, without preamble, because she had decided that preamble was a form of fear, "These are the household accounts for Hartwell Manor, fiscal year 3 through fiscal year 5. These marks indicate entries where the recorded figure differs from the original invoice." She laid the 7 invoices alongside them, one by one, aligned precisely. "These are the original invoices, from the archive. You will note the handwriting on the archive filing is your own, Mr. Graves." He said nothing. His hands lay still. "This," she said, placing Mr. Addison's note, "is a pharmacist's analysis of a compound found in an unlabeled bottle in the stillroom of this house, behind the labeled household stock. The compound is an aconite derivative. Administered in small repeated doses over months, its effects are consistent with," she did not look away from him, "a wasting illness." Something crossed his face. For the first time, the pleasantness did not come back immediately. There was a half-second in which she saw what was underneath it, and what was underneath it was older and more complicated than she had expected, not the blank architecture of a man without feeling, but something that looked, briefly, like anguish. She filed it. She did not stop. "And this," she said, placing the final piece, "is a receipt from an apothecary in Calvert Street, London, dated 4.5 years ago. The compound listed is consistent with Mr. Addison's analysis. The handwriting is yours." The room was very quiet. Sir William Hatch said, carefully, "Miss Graves, the receipt shows a false name." "It does," Marian said. "I would ask, Sir William, whether the handwriting, which can be compared against any correspondence of Mr. Graves on file with the estate solicitor, is sufficient to establish authorship." Mr. Farnham was already opening his case. "I have correspondence here," he said quietly. Letters of instruction regarding the investment portfolio, in Mr. Graves's hand, going back 9 years. He laid 3 letters on the table. He laid the receipt beside them. The handwriting was the same. The upright, evenly spaced letters. The hand of a methodical man. Graves looked at the comparison for a long moment. His hands, Marian noticed, were no longer quite still. She watched his right thumb move, once, against his palm. The gesture she had been watching for a week, the motion of a man who was pressing on something that hurt in order to keep himself steady. She had read it, for a week, as the body language of anxiety. She understood now, watching it in this moment, that it was something older than this room, older than the scheme, and that understanding did not excuse him and did not erase Catherine Ashmore and did not change anything. But she noted it. Graves said, very quietly, "I would like to speak to my cousin alone." "No," Edmund said. Another silence. Sir William shifted in his chair. Colm, at the door, did not move. Then Graves said, looking at the table, "She was already dying." His voice was still quiet. The pleasantness was gone. What was underneath it was exhausted. "Catherine, she was already ill, genuinely ill, before it was not. She was not going to recover, and the estate needed." He stopped. He pressed his thumb once more against his palm. "She was not going to recover." "That is not," Edmund said, "a thing you were in any position to determine." A long silence. Graves said nothing further. Marian looked at him and thought of the word her mother had used for this kind of sorrow. The sorrow of a man who had done a thing that he had constructed an elaborate architecture of justification around, and who was discovering, in the light, with witnesses, that the architecture did not hold. She did not feel pity, precisely. She felt something harder and more honest than pity, which was the recognition that the architecture had cost Catherine Ashmore her remaining years, and that no accounting in any ledger could settle that debt. She stepped back. This part was not hers. Edmund said, "You will resign the management of all Ashmore investments as of today. Mr. Farnham will draw the papers. You will repay, over a term to be agreed, the amounts diverted from the estate accounts. In return, Sir William," he looked at the older man, "there will be no criminal proceeding. I will not put this before a magistrate." Sir William looked at him for a moment. "You are certain?" "I am," Edmund said. "My wife's name has been spoken of in the county for 4 years. I have no wish to extend that." A pause. "And my cousin has a daughter who is 9 years old, who has nothing to do with this." He looked at Graves. "I am told she favors her mother." Something broke in Graves's face. Marian saw it break, and she looked away, because some things were not for watching even when you were the person who had assembled the evidence. The papers were drawn. They were signed. Sir William and Mr. Farnham witnessed them. Graves left Hartwell Manor at noon, by the back road, in a carriage that Edmund had arranged, which was a generosity Marian had not anticipated and thought perhaps she should have. The library emptied. Colm escorted the guests to the door. Edmund and Marian stood in the library alone, in the quiet that follows the kind of morning that changes the shape of things, and she was aware of the fire running low and the October light outside the windows, going silver with approaching cloud, and the stack of documents on the table between them. He looked at the stack for a moment. Then he looked at her. He said, "You should know that I sent word to Sir William 3 days ago." She blinked. "Before I had the pharmacist's analysis." "Before you had the analysis." "Based on what you had told me, before you had the analysis." She understood what that meant. She stood with it for a moment, feeling its weight. "You trusted me without proof," she said. "I trusted you," he said, "the way one trusts a person who looks at accounts and tells the truth about what is in them, regardless of what it costs." A pause. "You left a position over a cook being shorted. That was a small matter." "No," he said quietly. "It was not." He looked at the window. Outside, the first of the November clouds were coming. "Mrs. Ashby, I owe you a debt I am not certain how to. You owe me nothing," she said. "I was doing my work." He turned and looked at her directly, and she stood still under it the way she had learned to be still, except that this time being still took more deliberate effort than it usually did, because this was not assessment or attention. This was something else, and she had been naming it to herself very carefully, and keeping it in a box marked "not yet," not this, not while the stakes are what they are. She was not a woman who confused gratitude for other things, or allowed herself to be offered comfort in the shape of something it was not. "Then I would like to speak with you," he said, "about something that is not the work." "Not today," she said. He considered this. There was something in his face that was almost a question, and then decided to be patience instead. And she found that she respected him more for the patience than she might have for the question. "When?" he said. "When the accounts are settled," she said. "When I know that what I am being offered is not the aftermath of a mourning." She looked at him directly. "I have been offered things in the aftermath of mournings before. They were not what they appeared." He nodded. He said nothing immediately, and when he did speak, it was not what she had expected. "Then I will wait," he said, "until you are satisfied that it is what it appears. Tell me when you are satisfied. That may take some time." "Mrs. Ashby," he said, with the grave quietness that she had come to understand, was not coldness at all, but the register in which he felt most precisely. "I have been waiting 4 years for the truth of one morning. I believe I can wait somewhat longer for the truth of another." She went to the window. Outside, the chestnuts were nearly bare, turning in the silver light. She thought of Catherine Ashmore, because fairness required it, and she thought of the cook in Warwickshire, and she thought of 20 years of being the person no one crossed the room for. She thought of the box she had kept things in, carefully labeled "not yet." She thought, "It has been long enough." She turned back. She said, "Ask me on a day that has nothing to do with this one." He looked at her. Something in his face opened, the first genuine opening she had witnessed, not the mask and not recognition, but something underneath both, warm and quiet and deliberate. "I will," he said. He asked her on the 14th of November, on an ordinary Tuesday, in the estate office where she had been going over the mended linen inventory, and he had come in ostensibly to review the winter stores, and had instead sat down and looked at her for a moment and said, "This is a day that has nothing to do with that one." She set down her pen. "I know," she said. "I am asking," he said, "because I wish to. Not because I am grateful, not because I owe you a debt, not because you have proven yourself indispensable to the household. I am asking because I have been watching you read the truth of things and act on the truth of things for 6 weeks, and I find I cannot imagine this house, or anything else, without the person who does that." He paused. "Marry me because you wish it. It is the only reason I will take." She had been told, once, by a woman she admired, that when the right thing arrived, it arrived without fanfare, and felt less like a revelation than like a door being opened that you had known was there for some time. She had not believed this. She believed it now. "I wish it," she said. He crossed the room. He took her hand in his working hand, and she thought of calloused palms and open ledgers and the way he had looked at the comparison of handwriting in the library with a face that gave nothing away until it gave everything, and she thought, the man who opens the door even after he has read the weather. Yes, that was what she wished. They were married on the 2nd of December, in the small chapel on the estate, in a ceremony attended by Colm, who stood in his position near the door with the expression of a man tolerating sentiment at high personal cost, and who wept openly during the exchange of vows, and afterward denied having done so with such conviction that no one contradicted him to his face. Cook sent up a wedding cake that was an architectural project of some ambition. The two housemates who had spent 6 weeks speculating, in lowered voices that carried with the specific fidelity of Hartwell's old stone walls, were given the afternoon to celebrate with what Marian privately felt was a generosity proportionate to the entertainment they had provided her. Mr. Farnham sent his congratulations and reported that the repayment agreement with Graves was proceeding on schedule. Sir William sent a letter that was brief and warm, and which Edmund read twice and set in the estate office drawer where he kept things he wished to keep. A letter came from Graves himself, addressed to Marian in the upright, even hand. Short, "I am told you found the receipt in the archive. I had forgotten I had kept it. I understand now that I kept it because some part of me knew the morning would come. I do not ask your forgiveness. I ask only that you tell my cousin his daughter has a good nurse. She does." She showed Edmund the letter. He read it once and handed it back. "Write to him that she may visit in the spring if she wishes." A pause. She should know the estate. Marian wrote the letter that afternoon. She thought, while she wrote it, of the word beneath pleasantness in Graves's face at the moment the documents were laid out, the exhaustion of a man who had built too much on a foundation that could not hold. She thought of his daughter, 9 years old, who had nothing to do with it. She sealed the envelope and set it to go with the morning post, and she thought, mercy is not forgiveness, and it is not the erasure of cost, and it is not what the world gave Catherine Ashmore. It is only the protection of the ones who come after. It will have to do. Colm retired in the spring, as he had apparently always intended to do at an age he declined to specify, to a cottage on the eastern edge of the estate that Edmund had offered him with a firmness that did not permit refusal. He took with him a pension, a cat he had been pretending not to keep for 3 years, and the distinction of having performed, on the morning of the tribunal, the one decisive quiet act that had gone mostly unnoticed. It had been Colm who, when Graves looked at the comparison of handwriting, and his hands went still, and his thumb pressed against his palm, had moved quietly to the library door and turned the key. Graves had not tried to leave, but Colm had turned the key. Marian thanked him for it on his last evening in the house, privately, and he said he did not know what she was referring to and went to supervise the packing of his cat. His replacement as butler was a young man named Pryor, who had impeccable references that Marian verified personally. November came again, and with it the first anniversary of a Tuesday in October that had had no business changing anyone's life, and Marian stood at the kitchen window in the early morning with her coffee and watched the last of the chestnut leaves come down in the November light, and Edmund came to stand beside her. She heard him before she saw him, still, always, and looked at the same view. "A year," he said. "Approximately," she said. "I was 3 days early. You were." A pause. "You are always exactly where you mean to be." She thought of the letter on a Tuesday morning, and the road to Hartwell, and a still-room shelf with a bottle turned to face the wall. She thought of accounts that were too smooth, and receipts that had been filed by a man who, in some part of himself, had been waiting for the morning. She thought of the light in this room, and the way it moved across a ledger, and the way a man's hands looked when he was reaching for a mask he had set down. She thought, the way out is through the middle in the light with witnesses. She had learned it late. She was done apologizing for the lateness. "I found what the concealment forgot to account for," she said. He looked at her, and there it was again, after a year, what she had named and kept and examined at length and found to be not gratitude and not aftermath, and not anything but what it was, the open expression of a man who had stopped expecting someone to say exactly those words. "You did," he said. Outside, the last of the chestnuts came down in the morning light, turning in the slow air the way they had on the first morning she walked this road, and the birds continued their business entirely undisturbed, and somewhere in the east wing a door stood open to the new cold, and Hartwell Manor held its breath, and then, at last, let it go. If this story warmed you, if you have ever been the one who looked for the truth of things in the columns no one else checked, and waited for the morning that made the looking worth it, then you know why I keep telling stories like this one. The chair by the fire is always here. The kettle is always on. Come back whenever you need a story that believes the overlooked will have their morning in the light. There is a moment in this one when she squares the papers, corner to corner, and puts them on the table that I keep returning to, and I would love to know which moment stayed with you. Leave it in the comments. I read every one. If you would like to keep a place by this fire, the subscribe button holds it for you. Sleep well and be steady with the truth, even when the morning has not come yet. It comes.